Story number 1.
The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As Ethan's dad drove him and his three best friends, Chris, Jordan, and Matt, up the winding gravel road toward the lake house. It was deep in the woods, a place Ethan's family owned but rarely visited except in the summer. But since his parents were out of town for the weekend, they had agreed to let the boys have a sleepover there, provided they didn't get into trouble. Ethan was excited at first. The lake house was secluded, with nothing but the dark forest stretching for miles around it. It sat right at the water's edge, an old wooden cabin with a wraparound porch. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Perfect for a weekend of video games, junk food, and horror movies. Ethan's dad dropped them off, reminding them to lock the doors and call if they needed anything before driving back down the long road toward town. The first couple of hours were normal. They set up sleeping bags in the living room, played cards, and ate way too many snacks. The fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Then, just as they were about to start their first horror movie, Matt noticed something. "Hey, was that door always open?" he asked, pointing toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. Ethan frowned. The door at the end of the hall, his parents' room, was open just a crack. "I thought it was closed," Jordan muttered. Chris scoffed. "It's an old house, probably just the wind." Ethan wasn't so sure, but he got up and shut the door anyway. He turned the lock for good measure. They started the movie, but halfway through there was a sound. A soft tap, tap, tap from down the hallway. Ethan paused the movie. "What was that?" Matt whispered. Chris shrugged, grabbing a handful of chips. "Probably a raccoon outside." Jordan shook his head. "That sounded like it was inside." Silence stretched between them. Then tap, tap, tap. This time it was louder. Ethan stood up, his stomach twisting. "Stay here." He grabbed his flashlight and walked down the hall. His heart pounded as he reached his parents' door. It was still shut, still locked. He hesitated before knocking lightly. "Hello?" No answer. He turned the handle. Locked. Just as he was about to walk away, thump! Something slammed against the door. Ethan stumbled backward. The others were already up, eyes wide. "Dude," Matt whispered, "someone's in there." Chris tried to laugh. "You guys are freaking out over nothing." "Nothing," Ethan hissed. "Something just hit the door." Jordan swallowed hard. "We need to leave." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, let's go." They grabbed their jackets and headed for the front door. It wouldn't open. Ethan's stomach dropped. Chris yanked the handle. "What the hell?" Jordan checked his phone. No signal. Matt tried the back door. Locked. Then, a creak from the hallway. Ethan turned slowly. The door to his parents' room was open. He knew he had locked it. The others saw it too. "Okay," Chris muttered. "That's not normal." Ethan took a step back. "Let's just stay together." They retreated to the living room, sitting in a tight circle, the flashlight casting shaky beams across the walls. Then came the whispering. Soft, faint, like someone just outside the room. Jordan's face was pale. "Tell me you hear that." They all did. Ethan gripped his flashlight. "We're leaving. Now." They moved fast, grabbed their bags, shoes. The whispering grew louder. Then from the hallway, a shadow, tall, still, watching. Ethan's breath hitched. "Run." They bolted for the front door. This time, it opened. They didn't look back, didn't stop running until they reached the road. They spent the night huddled together near the main entrance, too afraid to go back inside. At sunrise, Ethan's dad came to pick them up. They never spoke about what happened. But Ethan knew something was in that house, and it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain was coming down hard that evening as Lily, Sarah, and Emma made their way to the old farmhouse where they were planning to spend the night. It was the kind of house you only saw in horror movies. Weathered stone walls, tall windows with peeling shutters, and a large, overgrown garden. It had been empty for years, but when Lily's aunt had invited them to spend the weekend at the place, the girls couldn't resist. Lily had told them that the house belonged to her great-grandmother, who had passed away when Lily was young. The house had been closed up for years, and now, with the rain and the storm, the place felt even more remote and eerie. "I don't know, guys," Sarah said, her voice shaky as they trudged through the rain. "This place is, well, it's kind of creepy." Emma glanced at Sarah and gave her a teasing grin. "You're such a scaredy cat. It's just an old house." But Emma could see the doubt in Sarah's eyes too. The house was big, old, and imposing. As they reached the front steps, the wind howled and the sky flashed with lightning. The tall windows of the farmhouse seemed to loom over them, casting long shadows that stretched into the darkness of the yard. Lily, who had led the way up the steps, paused and looked back at her friends. "I told you it would be spooky. I'm not sure if it's just the storm, but it feels different tonight." Emma felt a twinge of unease, but pushed it aside. It wasn't the house that made her nervous, it was the storm. The howling wind and torrential rain made everything feel far too isolated, as if they were the only people left in the world. When they entered the house, they were greeted by the familiar smell of old wood and musty air. The floor creaked under their feet as they stepped into the entryway, which was lined with faded wallpaper and old paintings that seemed to watch them with blank eyes. A staircase curved up to the second floor, and off to the side was the living room, dimly lit by a single lamp. "This place is huge," Sarah said, a hint of awe in her voice. "I bet there are like 10 bedrooms. Lily nodded and tossed her bag onto the couch. "Yeah, and I used to love exploring here when I was little. My aunt's been taking care of the place ever since my grandmother passed." Emma and Sarah exchanged glances. Lily's family had never really talked about what had happened to her great-grandmother, but it wasn't unusual. People in Lily's family were known to keep certain things to themselves. Still, Emma wasn't going to press it. They began to unpack and settle in. Sarah pulled out a bag of popcorn and they made their way to the living room. The windows rattled in their frames as the storm raged outside, and every so often the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "I'm going to check the upstairs," Lily said after a while. "I know my aunt's kept a bunch of old stuff up there. She told me to go through it and see what to keep or throw out." "Do you want some help?" Emma asked, noticing the hesitation in Lily's eyes. Lily shook her head. "No, it's fine. You guys can stay here. I'll just be a few minutes." With that, Lily headed up the stairs. Sarah and Emma continued to watch the movie, but neither of them could shake the unease that had settled in the pit of their stomachs. The house was too quiet, and the storm outside made everything seem far more claustrophobic. Emma glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were wide, her focus fixed on the window. "You're not scared, are you?" Emma teased, nudging Sarah's side. Sarah gave her a weak smile. "No, it's just this place feels off, like it's holding something back." Before Emma could respond, a loud bang echoed through the house. It came from upstairs, from the direction where Lily had gone. Emma shot to her feet. "Lily?" There was no answer. "Lily?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling now. Still no response. Emma and Sarah exchanged a look of uncertainty. The air in the room seemed heavier now, and the wind outside howled louder. "Let's go check on her," Emma said, her voice firm, though her insides were twisting with nerves. She grabbed Sarah's hand, and the two of them hurried to the stairs. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit by the storm's flashes of light, and the floorboards creaked under their feet as they walked down the long corridor. At the end of the hallway was a door to what Emma knew was Lily's grandmother's room, a room that Lily had always said she hated. When they reached the door, they stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Emma could just make out the shadowy outline of Lily's figure standing inside the room. "Lily?" Emma called out, her voice shaky. Lily didn't answer. The room was dark except for the flashes of lightning that illuminated the space for a split second. Emma stepped forward and pushed the door open slightly. "Lily, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. But Lily didn't move. She stood perfectly still, staring out the window, her back to them. "Lily?" Emma repeated, now feeling a knot form in her throat. Suddenly, Lily's head snapped around. Her eyes were wide, and her face was pale as if she had seen something she couldn't explain. "Get out of here," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now." Before Emma could respond, the room grew cold, a chill that cut through to the bone. A gust of wind blew through the room, even though the windows were closed, and the door slammed shut behind them with such force that Emma and Sarah jumped. They backed away from the door, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Lily?" Emma asked, voice cracking. "I don't know what's happening," Lily muttered, her voice trembling. "I didn't hear anything, but I felt something in there. Something watching me." The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Sarah let out a small gasp. She turned to look at Emma, her face ashen. "I think we need to leave," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. "This place isn't right." Lily didn't argue. She turned toward the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in her chest. She pushed harder, her hands shaking as she tugged at the door. "Help!" she shouted, her voice rising in fear. Sarah and Emma both rushed to help, but the door still wouldn't open. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, and the shadows in the room stretched unnaturally. And then, just as suddenly as the pressure had built, the door swung open with a loud creak. They tumbled out of the room and into the hallway, gasping for breath. The storm outside seemed to have intensified, the wind now howling like something alive. They didn't look back. Downstairs, the house felt even more oppressive. The windows rattled in their frames, and the house creaked under the force of the wind. As they hurried toward the front door, the lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness for a moment. "Let's go. Let's get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice strained. Emma grabbed her phone to check the time. It was just past midnight. But when she glanced up, she froze. The hallway was filled with shadows. Shadows that didn't belong. They were not just from the storm. These shadows were moving, twisting, reaching toward them. And in the darkness, Emma could barely make out shapes. Figures standing in the hallway just beyond the reach of the dim light. The figures began to move toward them, and Emma's heart raced in terror. There was something in the house, something that was no longer willing to stay hidden. With a burst of adrenaline, the three of them rushed for the front door, but as they reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They screamed in terror, trying to open the door, but it was as if someone was holding it shut from the other side. And then Emma heard it, the softest whisper. A voice far too close to her ear. "Leave now." The voice was cold and distant, but filled with an unmistakable sense of urgency. Something in her told her to obey. With a final, desperate attempt, the door finally creaked open, and they rushed into the storm, not stopping until they were safely in the car, the farmhouse now far behind them. As they drove away, the lights of the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, but the chill they felt in the air stayed with them. None of them spoke as they left the farmhouse behind, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after they had crossed the threshold of the house. It wasn't until they were miles away and the storm finally began to calm that any of them spoke. "I'll never go back there," Sarah said, her voice a whisper. Neither Lily nor Emma could disagree. They all knew that whatever was left in that house, it wasn't done with them yet. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was the fall of my junior year when my best friend Jenna invited me to her family's sleepover weekend at their cottage by the lake. They had rented the house for the season, and Jenna couldn't wait to show it to me. She'd mentioned it a few times, but I had always been a bit hesitant. There were strange stories going around about the place, rumors that it was haunted. Of course, being the skeptic that I was, I brushed it off as pure superstition. But when Jenna asked me to come with her for a weekend of movies, games, and relaxation, I figured I could handle it. After all, it was just a sleepover. The cottage was a 2-story, old-fashioned wooden house perched on the edge of a quiet, fog-filled lake. It looked like something out of a mystery novel. Wooden beams, wide windows with faded curtains, a crooked porch swing. There was something about the house that felt both charming and unsettling. The air around the lake was always damp, and the forest surrounding it was dense, which gave the whole area an eerie, closed-off vibe. But Jenna had always been a bit of a nature lover, and I knew she'd been dying to get away from the noise of the city for a while. We arrived late on a Friday evening, with the sun already slipping beneath the horizon. Jenna's parents were unloading the car, and I was looking forward to catching up with her in the quiet of the cottage. We entered through the front door, which creaked as it opened. The inside smelled musty, but it had a homey feel with its old wood paneling and large stone fireplace. There was a flickering light in the living room, where a fire crackled, and it immediately put me at ease. Jenna had already set up the living room with blankets and pillows, ready for our sleepover. It was cozy, and the atmosphere was inviting, despite the lingering chill in the air. The first few hours were typical for a sleepover. We spent time talking, eating pizza, and playing a few rounds of cards. The The glow of the fireplace and the soft hum of the lake outside were comforting, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I couldn't place it, but it seemed like the house was almost too quiet. There was an odd stillness in the air, as if the place was holding its breath. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees rustled loudly, but inside, everything was almost perfectly silent, save for the crackling of the fire. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. At around midnight, after we had watched a couple of scary movies, Jenna suggested we go for a walk down by the lake. The idea of walking through the woods at night wasn't something that thrilled me, but I didn't want to be a buzzkill. I was also curious about the place, and Jenna assured me it would be fine. So, we grabbed our jackets, slipped on our shoes, and made our way out the door. The night air was crisp, and the moon reflected off the surface of the lake, creating a shimmering path across the water. The surrounding trees loomed like dark sentinels, their long branches swaying in the wind. It was peaceful, in a way, but there was an undeniable heaviness in the air. Every creak of the branches and rustle of the leaves seemed louder than it should have been, and the stillness around us was unsettling. The further we walked, the more I began to feel the weight of the silence. It felt like we were being watched, but I couldn't shake the thought that it was just the isolation of the place playing tricks on me. "Let's head back," I said, starting to feel a little uneasy. Jenna glanced at me and laughed. "You're such a scaredy cat. We've got the whole weekend here. Come on, let's explore a little more." But I wasn't convinced. "I think I heard something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jenna stopped walking and listened for a moment. The wind was howling through the trees, but aside from that, there was nothing. No footsteps, no animal sounds, just silence. "You're just imagining things," Jenna said, still laughing. But her laughter had a nervous edge to it. We continued walking for a little while longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every few steps I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Finally, we reached the edge of the lake, where water lapped gently at the shore. The wind was cold, and I could feel a chill creeping up my spine. I didn't want to stay any longer. "I think we should go back now," I said, my voice trembling. "Please, Jenna." Jenna rolled her eyes, but there was something in the way she looked at me that made me feel like she understood. Something was off about the night, and neither of us wanted to admit it. As we turned around to head back to the cottage, I thought I heard something again. A faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name, but when I turned to look, there was no one there. We walked quickly back to the cottage, the sound of our footsteps louder than the wind, almost too loud. I didn't say anything, but Jenna must have noticed that I was tense, because she didn't make another joke. The closer we got to the cottage, the more I felt like the woods behind us were closing in, as if someone was watching us from the trees. It wasn't until we stepped back inside that I felt a little bit of relief. The door shut behind us with a soft click, and the warmth of the house hit me like a comforting embrace. But the sense of unease lingered. We settled back in the living room, and I tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at the pit of my stomach. Jenna's parents were downstairs, watching TV, and we were alone upstairs, in the room with the thick wooden beams and the small, dimly lit hallway. I could hear the occasional creak of the house, but this time it wasn't comforting. The silence felt oppressive. Around 2 a.m., we finally decided to go to bed. Jenna pulled the blankets around us as we snuggled into the large bed in her room. She seemed unfazed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the evening, the odd silence of the lake, the strange feeling I had when we were walking by the water. I kept thinking about the whisper. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I must have drifted off at some point, because I was woken up by the sound of footsteps outside the door. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing the hallway. At first, I thought it was just Jenna's parents coming up to check on us, but then the footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, hoping it would pass, but instead of walking away, the steps seemed to come closer to the door. My heart raced, and I slowly sat up in bed. My eyes flickered to the door, which was barely ajar. A shadow passed beneath the crack, moving from one side of the door to the other. "Jenna?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Jenna stirred beside me, but she didn't respond. The footsteps continued, moving just outside the door, then stopping again. I could hear faint breathing, like someone was standing right outside, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there, my body frozen in fear. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. It couldn't be real. It had to be my imagination. And then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, the door creaked open slowly, inch by inch. I gasped and jerked back, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered white nightgown that seemed to hang loosely on its frame. The figure's face was obscured by a mass of tangled hair, but I could see the faint outline of eyes that glowed in the dark, staring directly at me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed with terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the shadows. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the house was silent again. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed Jenna by the shoulders, shaking her awake. "Jenna, wake up! We need to get out of here now!" She groggily opened her eyes, clearly confused, but when she saw the panic in my face, she bolted upright. "What's wrong?" "There's something in the house," I gasped. "I saw it. We have to leave." I didn't wait for her to respond. I yanked her out of bed, and we both ran downstairs, ignoring the shouts of her parents. We didn't even bother to explain. All I could think about was getting as far away from that cottage as possible. As we stepped outside into the cold night air, I glanced back at the dark silhouette of the house behind us. I swear I saw a shadow move in the upstairs window. We didn't go back inside that night. We drove straight to a nearby hotel and stayed there until morning, too terrified to even talk about what had happened. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. But whatever it was,
Story number 4.
we were so excited for the sleepover. It had been planned for weeks, and the anticipation had been building up for months. The day had finally arrived, and after school, my best friend, Rachel, and I packed our bags, ready for a night of movies, pizza, and endless talking. Rachel's house was just a few blocks from mine, a large 2-story home on the outskirts of town. It had been in her family for generations, passed down from her great-grandparents. The house had always fascinated me. Its old, creaky wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, the tall windows that seemed to reach toward the sky. I was always a little nervous in the house, though. It was hard to shake the feeling that there was something about the place that didn't feel quite right. But Rachel was so comfortable there, and it didn't seem to bother her, so I pushed the feeling aside. That evening, as the sky turned dark and the rain began to pour, we settled into the living room. We laid out blankets, stacked up a few pillows, and turned on the TV to start the first of many movies we had planned to watch. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew more intense, the wind howling against the windows and the rain coming down in sheets. The storm made the house feel even more isolated, and as the wind whistled through the trees, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, but as the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, and every now and then, I could have sworn I heard footsteps upstairs when Rachel and I were the only ones in the house. "You hear that?" I asked Rachel, my voice barely a whisper. Rachel turned toward me, her eyes wide. "What?" "I thought I heard footsteps upstairs," I said, my voice shaky. Rachel laughed, though there was a nervous edge to her tone. "It's probably just the house settling. You know how old it is. Don't worry about it." I nodded, but the feeling didn't go away. I tried to focus on the movie, but every time the wind picked up or the house creaked, my heart would race. Rachel seemed oblivious to it, engrossed in the film as I glanced nervously at the dark hallway leading to the staircase. It was unnerving, to say the least. As the night grew later, the storm outside became more violent. The windows rattled and lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white light. The power flickered twice, then went out completely. The sudden darkness made the house feel even more oppressive, and the silence that followed the storm was deafening. "Okay, this is a little creepy," I admitted, trying to laugh to ease the tension. "But we'll be fine. It's just a power outage." Rachel didn't respond right away. I turned to look at her, but she wasn't looking at me. Instead, She was staring at the hallway, her expression frozen in fear. Her eyes were wide, and her lips were slightly parted, as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. "Rachel?" I asked softly, my voice shaking slightly now. She didn't answer. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I turned to follow her gaze toward the hallway. At first, I didn't see anything. It was just the darkened hallway, with the faint light from the street lamp outside casting strange shadows across the walls. But then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the stairs, I saw a figure. It was barely visible in the darkness, but there was no mistaking it. It was a tall figure, standing completely still, just watching us. I could see the outline of a person, but their features were obscured in shadow. I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's eyes widened, and she nodded slowly, her face pale. "I see it." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure didn't seem to notice us. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't know what to do. Should we call someone?" I stammered, but Rachel didn't answer. She was still staring, her mouth trembling. I didn't know if she was too scared to speak or if she was in shock. Suddenly, the figure moved. It took a step forward, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was slow, deliberate, like it was trying to approach us without making a sound. My entire body was frozen with fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, even as my brain screamed at me to look away, to run. Rachel bolted up from the couch. "We need to get out of here," she screamed. But before she could reach the door, the figure stepped into the dim light from the street lamp outside, and we could see it more clearly. It was a man. His clothes were old-fashioned, almost from another time. His hair was dark, and he had a tall, thin frame. His eyes were wide, and his face was pale, almost gaunt, but his expression was empty, void of any emotion. The worst part was that he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring at us with an eerie intensity. Rachel grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We need to go, now." I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The figure didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze burning into me, even as Rachel pulled me toward the door. Just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with an ear-splitting bang. We both screamed and turned to look at the hallway again, but the figure was gone. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if something was pressing down on us. Rachel tugged at the door, but it wouldn't budge. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. "What's happening?" I cried, my voice high-pitched. "Why won't it open?" I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder, and it seemed like the walls of the house were closing in around us. Every noise was amplified, the sound of my own breathing, the wind outside, and the distant creaking of the house. We backed away from the door, and just as we did, we heard a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but then it became clearer. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, a low, guttural tone that seemed to echo in the back of my mind. I whipped around to look at Rachel, who was staring at the hallway again, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispering grew louder. "Leave. Now." I could hear the urgency in the voice now, and I felt a cold chill run through me. We needed to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The wind howled, the house groaned, and the whispering intensified, as if the very walls of the house were alive, pressing in on us. With trembling hands, I grabbed Rachel's arm. "We need to find another way out," I said, my voice cracking with fear. We turned to run toward the back door, but before we could make it, a loud crash echoed through the house. The lights flickered again, and the figure appeared in the doorway. But this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving, slowly, with a strange, jerky gait, as if it were struggling to walk. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and the figure's movements were unnervingly unnatural. "Run!" Rachel screamed, pushing me toward the back door. We were desperate, frantic, and our movements were all rushed, panicked. We reached the door and yanked it open, but the figure was right behind us. It was close now, and we could hear its footsteps, slow but steady, closing the distance between us. The rain was still pouring outside, but we didn't care. We ran as fast as we could, not stopping until we were at the neighbor's house, gasping for breath and soaked to the bone. We never went back to Rachel's house that night. We couldn't bring ourselves to, not after what we'd seen. The figure, the whispers, the coldness. It was as if something evil had been trapped inside the house, waiting for us. Rachel's parents returned the next day, but Rachel and I never spoke of what happened. Neither of us could fully explain it, but we both knew what we had experienced was real. Whatever haunted that house, it wasn't something that belonged in this world. Years later, Rachel's family sold the house. It stood empty for a while, and I heard from others that the new owners never lasted long. No one could stay in the house for long, they said. It was cursed. The house was alive with something dark, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear that voice calling out to me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. It was a weekend sleepover at my best friend Emily's house. We had been planning it for weeks, and when the day finally came, we were more than excited. Emily had always lived in a big old house on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that looked spooky even in the daytime, with creaky floors, tall, narrow windows, and a front yard surrounded by thick, dark trees. But despite the house's eerie exterior, Emily's family was warm and welcoming, and the house always felt safe when we were together. There were 4 of us that night: Emily, her younger sister Chloe, our friend Sarah, and me. We had planned to spend the evening watching movies, playing games, and telling spooky stories. We had done this many times before, but this time something felt different. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The evening started off like any other sleepover. We made popcorn, piled up blankets on the living room floor, and dimmed the lights for our horror movie marathon. We watched cheesy slasher films, the kind that made us laugh more than they scared us. Around midnight, we decided to tell ghost stories, the kind that always seemed more exciting when told in the dark, with only a flickering candle to light the room. Emily went first, recounting a ghost story her grandmother had told her about a woman who wandered the woods near the house, searching for her lost child. It was a chilling story, but we were all too comfortable to truly be afraid. After her story, Chloe, who was just a little younger than us, told a story about a ghost that haunted her room. The story was silly and made us all giggle, but something about her delivery made it seem a bit more real. It was as if she believed it herself. Then it was Sarah's turn. Sarah was always the one who took things too far, the one who liked to creep everyone out with the darkest, most twisted stories. She began telling us about a family who had lived in the house before Emily's family. She described the family's tragic deaths in such vivid detail that it sent a chill down my spine. The story was unsettling, but what made it worse was the way Sarah spoke, her voice low and serious, as though she had been there, as though she knew it all firsthand. She ended her story with a warning. They say the house never forgets, and sometimes it wants to remind you that it's still watching. That was when the room grew uncomfortably cold. I didn't notice it at first, but the air seemed to shift around us. The warm, cozy atmosphere we had all been enjoying suddenly felt distant and hollow. Chloe shivered and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Emily looked at Sarah, her face pale, but said nothing. We moved on quickly, laughing nervously as we tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in the room. But as the night wore on, something strange began to happen. The lights flickered, then dimmed, as if the electricity was failing. The sound of the wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, sending an eerie wail through the house. It was the kind of sound that seemed almost too unnatural, too loud. And in the distance, just beyond the windows, I swore I saw something move, a shadow darting just out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked again, nothing was there. We decided to head upstairs to Emily's room to sleep, but as we made our way up the old staircase, a door slammed shut behind us, so hard that the walls shook. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. We turned to look at each other, but none of us spoke. We were all thinking the same thing. What was that? The stairs creaked under our weight as we made our way up to the second floor. Emily's room was at the end of a long hallway, a hallway that was always dark no matter how many lights you turned on. The house had a way of swallowing light, making every corner feel darker than it should be. When we reached Emily's room, we quickly closed the door, half laughing at ourselves for being so scared. We tried to ignore the sounds coming from downstairs, but it was hard to shake the feeling that we were not alone. We stayed up for a while, talking and trying to distract ourselves, but the noises from the house seemed to grow louder. A faint tapping sound came from the walls, like someone was knocking from inside them. It was faint at first, so soft that we thought it was our imagination. But as the minutes passed, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone was trying to get out. We all fell silent, our eyes wide with fear. No one moved. No one spoke. We all heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the room. I felt my skin prickle with unease as I stared at the walls, my breath shallow and quick. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Emily replied, her face as white as a sheet. "There's something wrong with this house. I've always known it." I glanced around the room, looking for any sign of an explanation. There were no pipes in the walls, no vents, just old, thick plaster. I couldn't understand how the tapping could be coming from anywhere but inside the walls themselves. It wasn't possible, and yet it was happening. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from downstairs, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. We all jumped, and Emily gasped, clutching at my arm. Chloe was the first to speak, her voice shaking. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, the door to the room slammed open, so hard that the hinges groaned. The air grew cold, freezing our skin. In the doorway stood a shadow, tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was as though it was made of darkness itself, a silhouette that shifted and moved like smoke. We screamed and scrambled away from the door, but the shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I couldn't see any features on its face. It was a presence, a malevolent force that hung in the air, thick, suffocating. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The door slammed shut again, and the room was silent. We didn't know what to do. We couldn't stay in the room anymore, but we were too scared to leave the house. Every part of me screamed that we should run, but where could we go? The house seemed to stretch endlessly around us, its dark corridors closing in on us. I remember Emily grabbing her phone and trying to call her parents, but there was no signal. No signal at all. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. We sat there, huddled together in the dark, the cold air still biting at our skin. The silence was unbearable. Then, slowly, we heard something else. The soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside the room. None of us dared to move, too terrified to even breathe. The footsteps grew closer, and then there was a soft knock on the door. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even look at the others. We all sat frozen, paralyzed with fear. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the knocking stopped. The door creaked open, but there was no one there. We didn't wait any longer. Without a word, we ran. We bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not stopping until we were safely in Emily's neighbor's house, too terrified to go back inside. We never spoke of that night again. Emily's family moved out shortly after, and the house was sold to new owners. I don't know what happened to the house or to whatever was in it, but I do know one thing. That night changed me. It changed all of us. We all knew that something dark and dangerous had lived there, something that wasn't quite human, and it still haunted that house long after we left. I've never forgotten the shadow in that doorway, nor the feeling of being watched. I don't know what it wanted from us, but I pray it never follows me. Story the end.
Story number 6.
It was a Friday afternoon when Emma and her two best friends, Olivia and Sarah, pulled up in front of Emma's childhood home. The house was large, old, and a bit worn around the edges, but it had character. The paint was peeling on the porch, and the shutters were hanging crookedly on the windows. Still, there was something comforting about it, something familiar. Emma had spent almost every summer at the house, visiting her grandparents who had lived there until a few years ago when they passed away. After that, the house had remained largely empty. Emma's parents came by every so often to keep the place in decent shape, but it wasn't as lively as it used to be. This weekend, Emma had invited Olivia and Sarah over for a sleepover, hoping to relive some of the good times they'd had when they were younger. Emma's parents had gone out of town for the weekend, so it would be just the three of them. They had big plans for watching movies, eating junk food, and maybe telling ghost stories like they used to. When they entered the house, the familiar smell of old wood and musty furniture hit Emma's nostrils, a scent she hadn't smelled in a while. The place was just as she remembered, although the stillness of it felt different now, almost oppressive. Her grandparents used to fill the house with warmth, but now it felt empty. A quiet sort of emptiness that made her uncomfortable. "So what's the plan for tonight?" Olivia asked, looking around at the large living room. "Movie marathon, junk food, and some ghost stories," Emma replied with a grin. "We'll start with the classics." "I'm in," Sarah said, already heading for the kitchen. "Let's get some snacks." They spent the next hour getting comfortable, setting up blankets and pillows on the floor in front of the TV. The house creaked as they moved around, but it wasn't unusual for an old house. Emma tried to shake off the odd feeling in her chest, but it lingered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three girls settled in for their first movie. They watched a few cheesy horror films, eating popcorn and laughing at the absurd plot twists. But as the night wore on, the house began to feel colder, despite the heat outside. Around midnight, Sarah suggested they take a break and go upstairs to Emma's room to tell ghost stories. The stairs creaked under their feet as they ascended, the house seemingly coming alive with every step. Emma's room was at the end of the hall, and as they entered, they sat on the bed, pulling the blankets around them for warmth. "This house has always felt weird at night," Olivia said, looking around. "I don't know if it's just because it's so big and empty now, but I get this strange feeling sometimes." Emma nodded. "Yeah, I get that too. I'm sure it's just the history of the place. The whole old house vibe." "Yeah, but it's not just that," Olivia insisted. "It feels like we're being watched." Emma shrugged, trying to push the feeling aside. "Let's tell some ghost stories." "That's probably just your imagination running wild." The three girls spent the next half hour telling spooky stories, one more outlandish than the next. They laughed, but the atmosphere in the room was growing heavier, and the cold was seeping in. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but that didn't explain the chill creeping up Emma's spine. Just as Emma was about to tell her own ghost story, they heard something. It was a faint sound at first, like a soft shuffle coming from downstairs. The girls paused, looking at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Emma frowned. "It's probably just the house settling. It does that sometimes." But even as she said it, she wasn't so sure. The sound had been too distinct, like footsteps, and they were coming from the kitchen. "I'm going to check it out," Emma said, standing up. "Are you sure?" Olivia asked, her eyes wide. "Maybe we should just lock the door and go to sleep." "Nothing's going to happen," Emma replied, though she didn't sound as confident as she had before. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked down the hall toward the stairs. The house felt even colder now, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally as she descended the stairs. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness, and every creak of the floorboards made her jump. The kitchen was dark, and as she reached for the light switch, she hesitated. There was another noise. This time it was louder. A thud. A soft, dull thud, as though something heavy had fallen in the kitchen. Emma stepped into the room, her heart pounding. The kitchen was empty. The only thing in the room was the old wooden table, which was cluttered with random items, some of which had belonged to her grandparents. Emma scanned the room, her eyes darting around, trying to find a source for the noise. She was about to turn back when she saw it. The door to the basement. It was slightly ajar. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She was sure she had closed it earlier when they came down to watch the movies. Her grandparents had always warned her to keep the basement door locked. They never said why, but Emma had always obeyed. But now, it was open. She swallowed hard and slowly walked over to the door. It was dark down there, pitch black. The air felt colder as she drew closer. She was about to reach for the door when she heard something, a soft scraping sound like fingernails dragging across the wood. Emma froze, her blood running cold. The sound stopped suddenly, and the house seemed to fall silent again. "Emma?" Olivia's voice echoed from upstairs. Emma didn't answer immediately. She stepped back from the door, her heartbeat pounding in her chest. After a moment, she turned and hurried back up the stairs. Her legs felt like jelly, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, though when she glanced over her shoulder, the hallway was empty. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern when Emma returned to the room. I don't know," Emma said, sitting down on the bed. "There's something weird going on downstairs. The basement door, it was open." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "So? It's probably just an old house thing." "No, it wasn't like that," Emma replied, shivering. "I know I locked it, and I heard something scraping, like nails." Sarah's face went pale. "That's freaky." Just as Emma was about to speak, there was another noise. This time, it was coming from upstairs. A soft thud followed by a slow dragging sound like something was being dragged across the floor. Emma's stomach dropped. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. They all nodded, their expressions tense. "Okay, we need to get out of here," Olivia said, her voice shaking. "Now." But as they tried to move, the door to Emma's room slammed shut. The sound was so sudden, so forceful, that all three girls jumped back in shock. They rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. "We're trapped," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and then they heard something else. A whisper. It was faint at first, but then it became clear. A voice, soft, cold, like it was coming from the other side of the door. "Help me." The whispering sent a wave of terror through all of them. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of a door creaking open. And then it went quiet, too quiet. Emma, Olivia, and Sarah stood frozen for a long moment, listening for anything that would explain what was happening. But all they heard was the sound of their own panicked breathing. After what felt like hours, Emma found the courage to reach for the door again. This time, when she tried the handle, it turned easily. The door swung open, and the hallway beyond was completely still. The dragging sound had stopped. There was no whisper. There was nothing. "Let's go," Olivia said urgently, her voice barely more than a whisper. They bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not stopping until they were standing on the front lawn, gasping for air. None of them spoke for a long time, each girl processing what had just happened in her own way. They didn't know what they had heard or what had been in that house. All they knew was that something had been there, something that wasn't human. As they stood there staring at the dark, empty house, they could see the shadowy outlines of the windows, each one watching them, waiting. They never returned to that house again. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was a warm autumn evening when I arrived at my friend Kate's house for a sleepover. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. Kate and I had known each other since childhood, and we had shared countless sleepovers in the past. Her house, an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town, had always felt a bit mysterious to me, with its towering spires and large, drafty rooms. But I never let the house's creaking floors and shadowed corners spook me before. At least, not until that night. The evening started innocently enough. There were 3 of us, Kate, her cousin Laura, who was visiting for the weekend, and me. The plan was to have a movie marathon and stay up late, just like we did when we were younger. But there was something about the air that night, something I couldn't put my finger on, that made it feel different from all the other sleepovers. We settled in the living room, surrounded by blankets and pillows, and popped in a DVD. The house was quiet, too quiet for a place that was usually bustling with activity. Kate's parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving us alone in the house. We were free to do whatever we wanted, but instead of feeling liberated, I felt an odd sense of unease that seemed to grow the longer we stayed there. Kate's house had always been big and beautiful, but it was also old. The kind of house that had creaky floors, drafty windows, and an unexplainable chill that lingered in certain rooms. The attic was a particularly unsettling place. It was always locked, and no one ever went up there. Not because it was off limits, but because it was known to be odd. Kate had told me stories about strange noises coming from the attic late at night, but I had always chalked it up to the house settling or the wind blowing through the old windows. As we watched the movie, I kept feeling a cold draft blowing across the back of my neck, like someone was standing behind me. I'd turn around quickly, but of course there was no one there. I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. so I tried to shake it off, but the air felt heavier somehow, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, darker. The quietness of the house became deafening. "Are you okay?" Kate asked, looking at me from across the room. "You look a little pale." "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired, I guess." But I wasn't just tired. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like we weren't alone in the house. It wasn't the usual feeling you get when you're in an unfamiliar place. It was something deeper, more sinister. I glanced over at Laura, who was sitting next to me, but she was completely absorbed in the movie, not seeming to notice anything unusual. Kate, too, appeared to be unbothered, laughing at a scene in the film. Suddenly, the sound of a door creaking open echoed through the house. It was so loud that it cut through the silence of the room, and all three of us froze. I turned to Kate. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Kate's face went pale. "Yeah, that was the front door." "But how could that be?" We were all sitting in the living room, and no one had moved. It was as though the door had opened by itself. I stood up, my heart racing, and slowly made my way toward the hallway. The door to the front entrance was wide open. I could feel the cool breeze from outside sweeping in, and the door itself was slightly rattling, as though someone had just walked through it. I stepped cautiously into the hallway and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to step outside and look around the yard. The grass was empty, nothing but the soft rustling of the trees in the wind. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, and looked at Kate and Laura. "Did either of you open the door?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice was shaking. "No," Laura replied, her face ashen. "We were sitting here the whole time." Kate didn't say anything. She was staring at the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. The air felt even colder now, the draft in the room growing stronger. The house seemed to be alive, breathing with an eerie energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said, trying to reassure myself more than them. But Kate's eyes were fixed on the ceiling, her brow furrowed in confusion. "You guys don't hear that?" We all stopped, straining to listen. There it was again, the soft sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. The kind of footsteps you hear when someone is walking around, pacing back and forth. "Who's up there?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "No one," Kate replied, her face pale. "My parents aren't here. We're the only ones in the house." I swallowed hard, feeling my heart race. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. There was no way anyone could be up there, but the sound was undeniable. It was real. It was happening. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the attic, so loud that it seemed to shake the whole house. We screamed, running back into the living room and huddling together. I felt dizzy, disoriented. My hands were clammy and I could barely breathe. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, barely able to control my panic. Kate's voice was shaky, but she spoke, her words barely audible. "I don't know. I've heard those sounds before." "From the attic?" I asked, my voice tight. Kate nodded. "Yeah, when I was little, I used to hear them all the time. I thought it was just my imagination, but now I'm not so sure." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the sounds from the attic echoing through the house. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I looked around the room, but nothing seemed to make sense. The shadows were deeper now, stretching across the walls like dark, looming figures. Finally, Kate stood up. "We have to check it out." "What?" I said, horrified. "Are you serious?" "No way." But Kate was already walking toward the stairs, determination in her eyes. "We can't just sit here. We need to know what's going on." Reluctantly, Laura and I followed her up the stairs, our feet heavy and sluggish as if the house itself was trying to hold us back. The creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet was deafening, and the footsteps from upstairs had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. We reached the attic door at the top of the stairs. It was a small, narrow door with a rusty latch. Kate hesitated for a moment before gripping the latch and pulling it open. The smell of old dust and stale air hit us immediately. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the small window at the far end of the room. I stepped back, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Kate, this is a bad idea. We need to leave." But Kate ignored me, stepping into the attic and flicking on the light. The light flickered a few times before illuminating the dusty, cobweb-covered space. The room was empty, save for some old furniture, boxes, and forgotten junk. There was nothing there, nothing but the eerie stillness. But then, as we stood there in silence, I heard something else. A soft whisper like the sound of someone breathing right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. Something was in that room, something unseen, something that didn't belong. We didn't stay long after that. The house seemed to close in on us, and the air grew thick with a sense of dread that none of us could shake. We ran down the stairs, grabbed our things, and bolted out of the house, leaving the front door wide open. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed at Kate's neighbor's house, unable to shake the image of the dark attic and the whispers that still echoed in my mind. The next morning, when we went back to retrieve our things, the house was quiet, still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The house had its secrets, and some things should never be uncovered. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The night was thick with anticipation as Mia and her friends, Lily and Charlotte, pulled into the driveway of Lily's house. The air was crisp, and a light fog had begun to settle over the small town. It was the perfect setting for their long-awaited sleepover. They had been planning this night for weeks, excited to catch up, watch movies, and share secrets that they had been holding on to since school started. Lily's house was older, situated on a quiet street on the outskirts of town. The once white paint had faded over the years, and the large front porch creaked under the slightest pressure. The windows, though sturdy, seemed to reflect more of the darkness outside than the inside light. Even though it was a familiar place for Mia and Charlotte, the house always had a certain eerie aura about it, especially at night. But they never let that bother them. After all, they were just teenagers having a fun night, right? "Come on, let's get inside before we freeze," Lily said, laughing as she opened the door and beckoned them in. The inside of the house smelled like warm wood and cinnamon, a comforting scent that Mia had always liked. The living room was spacious, with an old leather couch and a large fireplace that had been cold for months. A few family photos adorned the walls, and in one corner an old piano sat silently, emuffaid, its keys dusty from lack of use. The girls dropped their bags on the floor and began unpacking their things, tossing aside their jackets. Lily's parents had already gone out for the night, leaving the girls with the whole house to themselves. "Should we start with the movie marathon?" Charlotte asked, already pulling out her phone to scan for a list of movies. "Or do you guys want to tell some ghost stories first?" Mia grinned, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You know, I love a good ghost story, especially when it's this creepy outside. What do you think, Lily?" Lily hesitated for a moment. "I don't know. I don't really like talking about that stuff in this house." Mia raised an eyebrow. "Why? You're not scared, are you?" Lily looked uneasy but shook her head. "No, it's just, I've had some weird things happen here before. Nothing big, just small stuff that's hard to explain." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Lily shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Well, there's this one time when I was little. I was playing with my dolls in the living room, and I heard someone whisper my name, but there was no one there." Mia and Charlotte exchanged looks. "Okay, that's weird," Charlotte said, crossing her arms. "What happened after that?" Lily shrugged. "Nothing really. I got scared and went upstairs to my parents, but I didn't really think much of it until later. There are other little things too, like things disappearing and reappearing in different places." Mia laughed nervously. "Okay, now I'm starting to get the chills." Lily smirked. "You asked for it." The three girls settled on the couch, grabbing blankets and snacks, the warm light from the lamps casting soft shadows on the walls. They picked a random horror movie to start with, and for a while the strange, eerie feeling seemed to fade as they laughed at the cheesy plot twists and jumped at the occasional scare. But as the night wore on, the temperature in the room began to drop. Mia felt a chill run down her spine, but she dismissed it as nothing more than the drafty old house. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of discomfort in the pit of her stomach. It felt like something was watching them. "I think we should get more blankets," Mia suggested, trying to break the silence that had fallen over the group. Lily nodded, standing up. I'll go grab some from upstairs. Stay here. As Lily made her way toward the stairs, Mia and Charlotte exchanged a look. Something about the house felt off. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, and the sound of the old house settling was more pronounced than usual. "Do you feel that?" Charlotte asked in a low voice. Mia nodded, her heart beginning to race. "Yeah, it's like the house is alive or something." Before Charlotte could respond, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Mia jumped, her eyes darting toward the staircase. What was that? Charlotte's eyes were wide with fear. It came from Lily's room. "Maybe it's just the wind," Mia said quickly, trying to brush it off. But she knew, deep down, that wasn't it. Lily returned a moment later, her face pale. "You guys heard that too, right?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "What was that?" Mia demanded. Lily swallowed hard. I don't know. I was upstairs and heard something move in the hallway. It was like footsteps, but slow, heavy. Mia and Charlotte both looked at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. They tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the old house settling, or perhaps one of the pipes had made a noise. But deep down, they both felt something wasn't right. "I'm not staying down here alone," Charlotte said, her voice tight with fear. Lily nodded. "Let's just go upstairs and lock ourselves in my room. I don't want to be anywhere near the stairs right now." The three girls moved quickly up the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the hallway. Lily's room was at the far end of the hall, and as they passed each door, the air seemed to grow colder. The shadows in the hall looked deeper, darker, and the soft creaking of the floorboards under their feet made the house feel even older, even more haunted. Lily's room was the same as it had always been, but tonight it felt different. The air was thick with unease, and every small noise seemed amplified. As they huddled together on the bed, they all heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. Lily gasped, her face going pale. "It's not the wind this time. Someone's walking in the hallway." Mia's heart skipped a beat. "Is someone else here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so," Lily replied, her voice trembling. "My parents are gone for the night, and we would have heard the doorbell if anyone came in." The footsteps grew louder, slower. The sound was heavy, deliberate. It was as if someone was walking down the hallway toward them, each step measured and slow, like they were savoring the fear in the air. Lily stood up, her hands shaking. "We need to go downstairs. We can't stay here." Mia grabbed her arm. "Are you crazy? We can't go down there. Whatever it is, it's in the hallway." Lily's face was stricken with fear. "We can't just sit here, Mia. We have to do something." Before they could react, the door to Lily's room creaked open. The girls froze, staring at the dark figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't fully formed, but they could make out the outline of a person, tall, shadowy, and completely still. The air in the room grew frigid, and the lights flickered overhead. The figure didn't move, but the sense of dread in the room was palpable. It felt like the figure was watching them, studying them, waiting for something. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "Lily, what do we do?" Lily couldn't speak. She stood there, paralyzed with fear, unable to move or react. Then, as if on cue, the figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, toward them. It was the sound of its footsteps that terrified them the most. Each step was heavy, dragging, as if it was struggling to stay upright. Without thinking, Charlotte screamed, and the figure paused. For a brief moment, there was an eerie silence. And then it turned and slowly began to walk away, retreating down the hall. Lily slammed the door shut and bolted it. The three girls huddled together on the bed, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just sat there, frozen in terror. The house was still again. The footsteps were gone. The shadow had disappeared. But the feeling remained. The feeling that they were not alone. The girls didn't sleep that night. They stayed huddled together, too scared to move. The hours stretched on in silence, the house creaking and groaning around them. The air was thick with an unsettling energy, and every small sound sent them into a panic. When the first light of morning finally broke through the windows, the fear began to subside, but none of them spoke about what had happened. They just packed their things in silence, avoiding eye contact. Lily didn't want to stay in the house any longer. They left in a hurry, never looking back. They never spoke of the events of that night again, not to each other, and certainly not to anyone else. But deep down, they all knew what they had experienced. and no matter how hard they tried to forget, the image of that shadow, those slow, deliberate footsteps, would haunt them forever. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It was the kind of night you can only dream about in stories. The kind of night where the world outside feels quieter, where the air holds a touch of something inexplicable, something that leaves you feeling off balance. I should have known better than to ignore that feeling, but I didn't. The excitement of the sleepover, the nostalgia of being with my childhood friends, was enough to push any lingering sense of unease to the back of my mind. It was a Friday evening when I arrived at Amanda's house. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, and we had been planning this sleepover for weeks. It had been a while since we had all gotten together. Life had pulled us in different directions, but this weekend was about reconnecting. There was me, Amanda, her cousin Sarah, and Jane. The four of us had grown up together, and while some friendships faded with time, ours had always remained strong. Amanda's house, a large, 2-story farmhouse on the edge of town, had always given off an eerie feeling. It wasn't an ugly house, far from it, but there was something about its age that made it feel like it had secrets to keep. The floors creaked under our feet, and the windows, though large, seemed to reflect back something more than just our faces. Maybe it was because the house was so old, but no matter how much we tried to laugh off the unease, it lingered. When I arrived, Amanda was already inside, setting up the living room with blankets and pillows. She greeted me with a huge smile, and we quickly got to work getting everything ready for our movie marathon. Sarah and Jane arrived shortly after, bringing with them bags of snacks and an impressive stack of horror films. We had no intention of actually getting any sleep, just as we had done so many times before. The night was ours to enjoy, to tell stories and relive memories from our childhood. As the night went on, we watched movies, snacked on popcorn, and talked about everything from school to relationships, all the while laughing and teasing each other. It felt good to be back in the same room with these girls, the ones I had spent so many nights with as a child. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I remember looking around at the shadows in the corners of the room, noticing how the lights from the lamps seemed to flicker in and out, as if they weren't sure whether they wanted to stay on. And then there was the air. It was heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't quite place. At around midnight, we decided to take a break from the movie marathon and play a game. We had chosen the Ouija board, the game we always turned to when we wanted to spice up a sleepover with something a little creepy. Amanda had found it in the attic not long ago, and despite her parents' warnings not to mess with it, we all thought it would be fun. After all, we were older now, right? Surely, the superstition of it all had faded. I don't know what made us think that it would be harmless, but we went ahead anyway. The board was old, the wooden surface worn and scratched from years of use. We set it on the floor in the center of the room, the candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls around us. We all sat down cross-legged, our hands touching the planchette. At first, the board was silent. We asked the usual questions, laughing at the silliness of it all, but when nothing happened, we began to grow impatient. Then all of a sudden, the planchette moved. It was subtle at first, just a tiny shift. We all paused, unsure if it was one of us pushing it or if there was something else at play. But the movement continued. It began to glide across the board, slowly but deliberately. "Who's here?" Amanda asked, her voice wavering slightly as the planchette slid toward the word yes. We all stared at it. This wasn't a game anymore. It wasn't just the wind or a trick of the mind. Something was in the room with us. Sarah, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "It's just the board. Someone's moving it on purpose. Stop it." But no one moved their hands, and the planchette didn't stop. It moved again, this time landing on goodbye. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. It wasn't a gradual change. It was sudden, like someone had turned on a fan blowing cold air directly at us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment the room felt too small, too close. A silence settled over us, a heavy, oppressive silence that made every breath feel like it was too loud. The candles flickered and then went out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. We all jumped, but before anyone could speak, we heard it. A faint, distant sound. It was so quiet that at first I thought I imagined it, a whisper, a voice, not from any of us, but from somewhere deeper in the house, somewhere far off. "Get out!" I froze, the words hanging in the air. None of us had spoken, and yet it was as clear as day. A voice, the voice of a woman, soft and ghostly, warning us. Amanda was the first to react, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, too terrified to speak. Jane, who had always been the brave one, was visibly shaken. She grabbed the planchette and tossed it aside, pushing herself up from the floor. "This isn't funny anymore. Let's just go to bed." But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it deepened. We tried to shake it off, tried to convince ourselves it was just a prank or the house settling or a draft. But when we turned the lights back on, there was something in the corner of the room. A shadow. A figure, standing still, unmoving. It wasn't one of us. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at it, unable to move. The shadow was tall, thin, and strangely misshapen, like it was someone or something standing just beyond the light's reach. I couldn't see details, just the vague outline of a person. But the more I looked, the more my eyes seemed to play tricks on me. It seemed to shift and sway, as though it were somehow out of sync with the rest of the room. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. "But it's not real." But it was real. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping so quickly that we could see our breath fogging in front of us. I felt something grab at my chest as though the very air was pressing in on me, choking me, forcing me to breathe harder. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching us. I felt its gaze like a weight pressing on my skin. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. No sound, no movement, just a flicker, and then nothing. We didn't talk about it. We couldn't. The atmosphere in the room was thick, charged with something we couldn't explain. The rest of the night passed in a haze. We went to bed, but none of us slept. The sound of whispers and faint footsteps echoed through the hallways, and every now and then I would hear something that wasn't there. The air seemed to be alive with a presence that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. By morning, when Amanda's parents returned, everything was normal, or at least it appeared that way. The house was still quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget the figure, the voice, the overwhelming sensation that something had been watching us. I don't think any of us spoke about it afterward. We simply went on with our lives, pretending like it was just an odd experience we would eventually laugh about. But even now, every time I go to sleep in a new place, I feel a little uneasy, like I'm being watched. And sometimes, just before I drift off to sleep, I'll hear it again, a whisper in the dark. "Get out!" Story the end.
Story number 10.
The evening had started like any other sleepover. Emma, Sarah, and Lily had gathered at Emma's house for what was supposed to be a night of popcorn, movies, and talking late into the night. They had done it hundreds of times before. Each sleepover a mix of laughter, horror movies, and stories they all pretended not to be scared of. But this night was different. Emma's house was old, a Victorian-style home that had been in her family for generations. The house had an almost regal quality, with its dark wood paneling, creaking floors, and high ceilings. It was the kind of house you'd expect to see in a mystery novel, charming yet unsettling, especially when the sun set and the shadows stretched long across the walls. The girls didn't mind it, though. It was familiar to them. They spent most of their time in the living room, the heart of Emma's house, where they would sit by the fireplace and talk about their school day, crushes, and anything else that came to mind. But that night, as they made their way to the living room after dinner, there was an unsettling tension in the air, though none of them acknowledged it at first. "You know, I've never seen the house this quiet," Lily said as she flopped down on the couch, kicking her shoes off and tucking her feet under her. Emma shrugged. "What do you mean? It's always quiet at night." "I don't know, it's just eerie tonight," Lily muttered, looking around the dimly lit room. The light from the fireplace flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was only 9 p.m., but the house felt darker than usual. "Maybe it's the storm outside," Emma suggested, motioning to the window where the wind was picking up. The storm had been forecasted to be a big one, rain and gusty winds, but it had only started in the past hour or so. It always makes everything feel heavier. "True," Sarah said. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the selection of movies Emma had brought out. But she seemed distracted, glancing up at the windows occasionally. They settled in, wrapping themselves in blankets, and started a movie. The storm outside howled against the windows, and the sound of rain pounding on the roof gave the entire house a hollow, distant feeling. Every now and then, a gust of wind made the windows rattle, and the trees outside groaned as if something was moving through them. Emma couldn't help but feel uneasy. It was the way the house creaked with every gust of wind, how the air felt thick with humidity, making the room feel slightly too warm, despite the chill in the air outside. And it was the feeling that something was watching them. A feeling that had settled in her chest, tight and uncomfortable, like she wasn't alone. It was ridiculous. This was her home, after all, and there was nothing to be afraid of. But then it happened. About an hour into the movie, a loud bang echoed through the house. It was sharp, sudden, and it sent all three girls jumping in shock. The sound had come from upstairs, where the guest rooms were located. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep calm. Lily's face was pale, and she nodded slowly. "Yeah." "What was that?" "I'm sure it's nothing," Sarah said, trying to sound brave as she adjusted her position on the floor. "It's probably just the wind, right?" Emma wasn't so sure. She knew this house, and the way the sound had echoed through it was different. It didn't sound like wind or the house settling. It sounded like someone had dropped something upstairs. Lily stood up. "I'm going to check it out." "No way," Emma said quickly, grabbing her arm. "You're not going up there alone. We should at least check." Then Lily said, pulling away, though her voice shook slightly. "Maybe something fell." "I'll go with you," Sarah said, standing up as well. "Let's just look quickly and get back downstairs." Reluctantly, Emma followed, though a part of her didn't want to go up at all. There was something about the way the house felt in that moment, like it had become a different place altogether, a place where things didn't quite add up. They walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, as they made their way toward the staircase. The stairs creaked under their weight as they climbed to the second floor. The hallway at the top was dark, save for the soft light of the storm outside that filtered through the windows. The hallway stretched out before them, and the door to Emma's parents' bedroom was slightly ajar. That was where the sound had come from. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked in a whisper, her face turning pale. Emma listened, straining to hear anything over the sound of her own breath. There was something. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound. It was faint, but it was there. Lily looked at the others. "Let's just check the room quickly." With trembling hands, she pushed the door open, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside the room, nothing looked out of place. The bed was neatly made, and the dresser was still where it had always been. But on the floor near the window, something caught Emma's eye. A dark stain, large and unmistakable, marred the wood. It was the color of dried blood. Emma's stomach turned. "What is that?" Lily stepped closer, frowning. "It looks like something was spilled." The sound of the thumping was louder now, closer. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the air grew colder around them. She looked toward the door, her legs frozen in place. The thumping was now accompanied by a low, drawn-out creaking noise, like almost as though someone was moving slowly through the room. "Okay, that's it," Emma said, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But as she turned to run, she froze. In the corner of the room, standing by the window, was a figure. It was tall, shadowy, and almost featureless, but Emma could make out its outline in the darkness. She could feel its eyes on her, watching her, even though it had no face. The room seemed to darken even further as the figure grew closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Emma opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt paralyzed, as though it was no longer her own. Lily grabbed her arm, her breath ragged. "Emma, let's go!" But before they could move, the figure took a step forward, and the air around them grew unbearably cold. The room felt as though it was closing in on them, the walls pressing inward with each second. Emma stumbled backward, dragging Sarah and Lily with her. "Run!" Sarah screamed, and they bolted for the stairs. The figure followed them, its presence pressing on their backs like a heavy weight. Emma didn't dare look back, focusing on the stairs in front of her, her legs burning as she sprinted down the hallway. When they reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut in front of them, blocking their escape. "No!" Lily shouted, pulling at the door. The room at the top of the stairs seemed to stretch on forever as the sound of the figure's footsteps grew louder, closer. The girls backed away, their panic rising as they tried to find an escape route. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The footsteps stopped. The oppressive atmosphere vanished. Slowly, Emma turned to see that the door had opened on its own. But there was nothing there now. No figure. No sound. Just an empty hallway. The three of them stood there shaking, too terrified to move. They could barely catch their breath, their hearts racing in their chests. The figure had been real. The feeling of something dark and malevolent was still with them, lingering in the space between their breaths. They didn't sleep that night. They couldn't. The rest of the evening was spent huddled together in the living room, eyes darting to every corner of the room, waiting for something, anything to happen. By morning, they had made up their minds. They weren't staying another minute in the house. Emma's parents had already left for the weekend, and they didn't plan to tell them what had happened. The last thing they wanted was to hear the same story they had heard from other people in town. A story about the house being haunted by something that had never really left. But as they packed their things and walked out the door, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they had encountered that night had followed them. The air outside, though fresh, felt heavy, like something was still lingering close by, watching them. They didn't speak much about the night again. They couldn't. The memories of that shadow, that figure, haunted them all, even as they moved on with their lives. But Emma would always remember, and she would never forget the chill that had filled the house that night, the chill that had come from somewhere dark and ancient. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
It started like any other sleepover. My best friend Rachel had invited me to spend the weekend at her family's new house. They'd recently moved into a large, old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of town. The house was charming in a way that seemed both cozy and unsettling. Rachel had begged me for weeks to visit, and after a long, stressful stretch of schoolwork, I was excited for a weekend of fun, movies, and relaxation. The first time I arrived, I noticed how big the house was. It had a grand front porch with 2 rocking chairs, ivy creeping up the sides of the walls, and tall, narrow windows that seemed to stare down at the yard. The house had been well taken care of, but there was an undeniable air of age to it. There was also something about it that felt off. Maybe it was the way the shadows danced on the walls at night, or how the floorboards creaked underfoot, but I didn't give it much thought. Rachel assured me that the house was just old, nothing more. "Come on, don't be such a baby." Rachel had laughed when I mentioned the eerie feeling. "I know it's old, but it's not haunted or anything. Just a little creepy, that's all." That night, after a few rounds of our favorite movies, we decided to make the most of our time and stay up late. Rachel had set up a blanket fort in her living room with a pile of snacks, and we'd fallen into our usual rhythm of talking about boys, school, and childhood memories. We'd done this so many times before in different places, but tonight felt different. The house was too quiet, almost as if the walls were absorbing all sound. Around midnight, after we had finished watching a horror movie, of course, Rachel suggested we try something to really spice up the night. I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well, but curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. Rachel pulled out a small wooden box from under her bed, and I immediately recognized it. It was her old Ouija board. "Rachel, are you serious? We don't mess with that thing. You know what happened last time," I said, my voice low with concern. "Oh, come on. Nothing's going to happen. We're just having some fun." Rachel's smile was reassuring, but I could tell she was excited at the idea. She always loved the thrill of something spooky, and the more I protested, the more it seemed like she was going to do it no matter what. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The living room was dark, except for the dim glow of the television that still cast flickering shadows across the walls. Rachel spread the board on the floor, lit a few candles around it, and set the planchette in the center. I could feel a knot form in my stomach, but I kept my mouth shut. We didn't even say a word as we placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, waiting for something to happen. "Is anyone here?" Rachel asked in her usual playful tone, but there was a slight tremor in her voice. For a long moment, there was nothing. I almost convinced myself that maybe it was just the old board and the environment that was making everything feel strange. Then, out of nowhere, the planchette moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift, but it continued moving across the board. "Is this you, Rachel?" I asked, raising my voice slightly. "No, I swear I'm not moving it," Rachel replied quickly. "It's not me." The planchette glided effortlessly to the word yes. I felt my heart rate increase, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Neither of us said anything. For a long moment, the only sounds in the room were our shallow breaths. My palms were slick with sweat, and I had the overwhelming sense that someone was there with us. Rachel, probably trying to ease my nerves, spoke again. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice now unsteady. The planchette began to move again, this time more deliberately. It stopped at G, then R, then A. My stomach churned. I had a bad feeling. My eyes darted around the room, trying to shake off the feeling that we were being watched. The candlelight flickered as if the flames were reacting to the energy in the room. But Rachel was still transfixed by the board, her fingers lightly brushing against the planchette. "GRA," she said aloud, almost as if speaking the letters would make the thing go away. Then the planchette slid to ND. It spelled grand. We both stared at the board, confusion etched on our faces. Rachel had no idea who or what grand referred to, but she was still intrigued. I, on the other hand, was starting to get more and more uncomfortable. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and my breath was visible in the air. Rachel didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she wasn't bothered by it. Before I could say anything, the planchette started to move again. I barely had time to react as it flew across the board, stopping at S. Then T. Then A. "Stay," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. I could feel an immense pressure building up in my chest. The room seemed to close in on me. "Stay here," Rachel said softly, as if she was trying to reassure me, but her voice shook too. The candles flickered violently, and the power in the house surged, causing the lights to flicker. The air had become so cold now that I could see my breath in the dim light. I could hear it, the creaking of the old house. But this wasn't the usual house-settling noise. No, this was something far more deliberate. It was a slow, deliberate dragging sound, like something or someone was moving through the hallway toward us. I stood up, my heart racing. "Rachel, what's going on?" But she was already staring wide-eyed at the board, her hands frozen on the planchette. The dragging sound came closer. I could feel the floor beneath my feet vibrating ever so slightly. Something was coming. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was getting closer. My skin prickled with the sensation that we were no longer alone. There was someone, or something, standing just behind me. I turned to look, and there it was. A shadow. Tall and indistinct, but it was there, looming just outside the edge of the light. I gasped, stumbling backward. The shadow seemed to shift, growing darker, denser, as if it was made of the very darkness itself. My breath caught in my throat, and I reached for Rachel, but she didn't seem to hear me. She was still focused on the Ouija board, her face pale and drawn. She wasn't responding, her eyes wide and glassy as if she was in a trance. The shadow seemed to move forward, coming closer to me now. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, and I could feel the air grow thin around me. The dragging sound grew louder, like nails scraping across the floor. I turned to Rachel, shaking her violently. "Rachel, we need to stop this. Now!" But she wouldn't move. She didn't even blink. The shadow reached for me, and in that moment I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. That was when I screamed. The sound echoed throughout the house, but as soon as I screamed, everything stopped. The lights flickered once more, and the shadow disappeared into nothingness. The air in the room returned to normal, but the cold lingered. Rachel blinked and looked up at me, her expression confused. "What happened?" she whispered, shaking her head as if waking from a dream. I didn't know how to answer. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever that was, it hadn't left. I grabbed Rachel's hand and pulled her toward the door, not caring if we left the house in the middle of the night. I wasn't staying another second. We left the house as quickly as possible, not looking back. It wasn't until we were outside in the fresh air that I could breathe again. I didn't say a word to Rachel as we stood there, both of us in a stunned silence. We didn't speak of it again for a long time, but I could feel it, that lingering presence. In the months that followed, Rachel's family eventually moved out of the house. They said it was because of financial reasons, but I knew better. Something in that house was wrong, and I had a feeling Rachel knew it too. Every time I think back to that night, I can still feel the coldness of that shadow and wonder if it's still waiting in the house, waiting for the next person to dare step inside. Story the end.